PM's climate promises and how far India is on track to meet them. On the 5-point target announced by Modi, achieving net zero emission status by 2070 is one of the whose roadmap is not available right now. This promise seems to have been made primarily to satisfy the international demand. At the UN climate conference in Glasgow last Tuesday, Prime Minister Narendra Modi raised India's existing climate targets and also announced a few new targets. Importantly, none of the targets is likely to be too difficult to achieve. Net zero. Of the 5-point targets announced by Modi, achieving net zero emission status by 2070 is the one whose roadmap is not available right now. This promise seems to have been made primarily to satisfy the international demand. At the same time, a 2070 is a long way away, and there is plenty of time to plan a roadmap to achieve that target. The other four targets have to be achieved in a more immediate time frame by 2030. Emission intensity renewables. Two of the targets, reducing emission intensity and increasing the renewable mix is installed electricity capacity, are already part of India's official nationally determined contribution or NDC submitted in 2015 as part of the requirement under the Paris Agreement. In that NDC, India has promised to reduce its emission intensity or emission per unit of GDP by 33 to 35% from 2005 levels by 2030 and to ensure that at least 40% of its installed electrical capacity in 2030 would come through non-fossil fuel based energy sources. Modi has now enhanced both these targets, emissions intensity reduction to 45% and the share of renewables in installed electricity capacity to 50%. There was some confusion about the renewable target because of the words Modi used in his speech. He said India intended to fulfill 50% of its energy requirement through renewable energy by 2030. But all previous commitments were formulated for electrical capacity, which is only part of the larger energy basket. A senior official of the Indian Environment Ministry has since confirmed to the Indian Express that the enhanced target related to installed electricity capacity, not energy requirement. This will be reflected in the revised NDC India submits to the UN Climate Secretariat incorporating the new target. India was already on course to achieve both these targets well before the 2030 deadline. India's emission intensity was 24% below 2005 levels in 2016 itself, the latest year for which data are available. A 33 to 35% reduction is expected to be achieved within the next 2 years. Although initial reductions are easier to achieve than later ones, a 45% reduction is not expected to pose too much of a challenge. The case of renewable installed capacity is not very different. By November 2020, the share of renewables, including larger hydropower, in total installed electrical capacity has already crossed 36%. The share of non-fossil fuel energy sources was over 38%. Most of the new capacity additions are happening in the renewable space, and therefore taking this share to 50% will likely not be too difficult. Forest cover not addressed. The third promise made in India NDC about increase in forest cover did not find a mention in Modi's speech, and that is the only target India is struggling to achieve. In the NDC, India has promised to create an additional carbon sink 2.5 to 3 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent through forest and tree cover by 2030. Although forest cover has been growing according to official data, the pace of growth so far has been far from commensurate with what is required to meet the target. Non-fossil fuel. Modi's other two announcements about raising installed capacity of renewable energy and an absolute reduction of 1 billion ton of carbon dioxide by 2030 are not part of India's existing commitments but are not less linked. India had initially set out to install 20 gigawatt of solar power capacity by 2020 that was later raised to 100 gigawatt by 2022. Targets for wind and biogas were later added, making it a renewable energy power capacity target of 175 gigawatt for 2022. 2 years ago, Modi enhanced this to 450 gigawatt for 2030. None of this was part of the NDC but publicly announced targets India had set for itself. In Glasgow, Modi had said India would have 500 gigawatt of non-fossil fuel-based energy capacity by 2030. Non-fossil fuels include not just renewables like solar or wind, but also nuclear and hydro, which together make up 50 gigawatt right now. Achieving that 450 gigawatt target for renewable energy therefore would automatically achieve the target of 500 gigawatt for non-fossil fuel energy sources. Also, installed nuclear energy is in process of significant ramping up. Installed nuclear capacity is set to increase to 22 gigawatt by 2031 from the current 7 gigawatt. Absolute emission. The fifth target Modi announced was new and unexpected. The PM said India would ensure it reduces 1 billion ton from its projected emissions between now and 2030. Put another way, India would bend its business as usual emissions trajectory to ensure at least 1 billion tons of emissions are saved. This is the first time India has talked about making a reduction in its absolute emission. All previous formulation used to be in terms of emission intensity, which is emissions per unit of GDP. The 1 billion ton reduction promise and the emission intensity target, however, seems to be inextricably linked. The latter target too is about bending the emission trajectory. It seeks to ensure that while India's GDP as well as emissions would continue to grow, the rate of growth of emission would be slower than that of GDP, so that more GDP is created for the same amount of emission. Achieving the emission intensity target would mean that India would be emitting far less than its business as usual scenario. The numbers are not immediately evident, but this saving in emissions could form a substantial chunk of the 1 billion ton reduction now promised. It is possible it may even exceed 1 billion tons. The promise to reduce 1 billion tons of emissions could therefore be another way of reiterating the emission intensity target. Thank you.